I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. Welcome to IAS Thursday. I'd like to begin by remembering that the University of Minnesota is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of indigenous people. And the university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. And the Institute for Advanced Study acknowledges that this place has a complex and layered history. And this land acknowledgement is part of the ways in which we work to educate our campus and community about this land and our relationships to it and to each other. And the IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations. So thank you for coming. I just have a couple of announcements. Next Thursday, IAS Thursday, is part of our Spotlight series with the University Honors Program. Oh, next Thursday is spring break. Yay! Okay, cut that out of the video. So next Thursday is spring break. The following Thursday, which is March 19th, we will be in this same room for our Spotlight series with the University Honors Program and Northrop. And our program will be Policy Perspectives on Environmental Justice with Sam Grant and Halston Sleets. So we hope to see you there. For grad students in the room, the IAS-Research Computing, Human in the Data, MnDrive Fellowship Summer Program, applications are due tomorrow at noon. It's a short application. There's information available on the IAS website. And I want to just draw your attention, before I turn this program over, I want to draw your attention to an exhibit downstairs on the west side of the building in the IAS offices. So that's the second floor. And it's an exhibit called Righting a Wrong, Japanese Americans in World War II. And the posters come from the Smithsonian Institution, but there are artifacts and labels that were assembled and designed by Jacob Noble, who is a Heritage Studies student. And the artifacts come from the Immigration History Research Center. So we'd hope you will avail yourselves of the opportunity to look at the exhibit as well. So it's my great privilege to turn the program over to Professor Yuichiro Onishi, who is the interim director of the Immigration History Research Center and a faculty member in African American and African Studies and Asian American Studies. So Yuichi.
Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Yuichiro Onishi, faculty, like Jennifer said, African American, African Studies, and Asian American Studies, and also acting director of Immigration History Research Center. And I want to really welcome you all. But before I introduce the speaker, Duncan Ryūken Williams, I do wanted to express my appreciations to multiple people. First, IAS, Institute for Advanced Study, Jennifer Gunn, Susanna Smith, Brianna Manning, Karen Kinoshita, for really kind of helping us set up and facilitate the process of inviting Duncan to University of Minnesota. This event is made possible, again, with the funding from Institute for Advanced Study. There's a wonderful opportunity for faculty and community members and independent sort of scholars and artists to kind of work together, and it's called Research and Creative Collaborative. So my co-conveners, Catherine Squires of Communication Studies, John Matsunaga, Japanese-American artist, visual artist, local artist, and also faculty member, not faculty member, I should say adjunct faculty member in Asian American Studies, myself and Ezekiel Jobart, came up with this idea of historical injustices as a category with which to figure out how to reckon with the terrible past, the ugly sort of racial past and colonial past, and how institution, where we are, how we can begin to think about these imperatives. So this is our really a last event of our ongoing programming, as well as sort of a study group that we held. So I want to thank my co-conveners. Oh, Hana Mariyama, I'm so sorry, Hana, you are also one of the members, and I'm so sorry about that. Hana Mariyama, and then there are other members as well, the community members. But anyway, so co-sponsors, I want to thank Ann Waltner of History Department, Teresa Swartz, Asian American Studies program, Jean Kildee, the Religious Studies program, and Christine Moran of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies for support, co-sponsorship. And I also, above all else, this event really came from the community, the local Buddhist community, but specifically Twin Cities Buddhist Association and the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center came to us. Todd Tsuchiya in particular brought this to my attention to bring Duncan to the Twin Cities, so we all worked together to make it happen. So I want to really thank them. And Carolyn Naimatsu, Twin Cities, I forgot to mention her, Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League was also part of the planning and coordination, so I want to thank her as well. I think I got everybody. So before I introduce, I also wanted to really echo the importance of land acknowledgement. And it really is our ongoing effort for all of us here on this campus as settlers to really reckon with the ongoing presence really of Dakota people, and that we are on the homeland of Dakota people. And I think the imperative pushes us in a direction to really start rethinking even the whole idea of human progress, I think. And so I wanted to echo that sentiment. Okay, now it's a really great honor to introduce our speaker, Duncan Ryūken Williams. He's a professor at University of Southern California, a renowned scholar of Buddhism. He's also an ordained Buddhist priest in the Soto Zen tradition. He has taught at multiple institutions before taking the current position as the director of Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religion and Culture. And he's also a professor of religion, East Asian languages and cultures, and American studies and ethnicity at the USC. He has published so many books, single author books, including The Other Side of Zen, published by Princeton University. He's translated multiple books from Japanese to English. He has put together, edited multiple anthologies from Hapa, Japan, and Issei Buddhism in Americas, most recently, to American Buddhism and Buddhism and Ecology. Today he'll give a talk on the latest book, American Sutra, and it's published by Harvard University Press in 2019. And I learned that it's been in the making for so long, to be precise, 17 years. And this book really opens up to the world little known, which is the struggles and experiences of Japanese American Buddhists during World War II. And I read the book. To read this book is like taking a journey into the texture, really, of their life, struggles, and experiences, and he tells it with much richness and intricacies. So I want to welcome Duncan to the Twin Cities campus. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yujiro, thank you for such a kind introduction. Thank you to all of the many sponsors for today's lecture, and thank all of you for coming out. I know Yujiro was telling me this weather is is actually fairly warm or something for this, but coming out from LA, I was like, I don't know if anybody's going to turn up, but thank you so much for coming today. Yujiro mentioned that this book took me from conception to completion about 17 years, and in terms of how I came to that, I wanted to share with you the story of this diary that came into my life. In Buddhism, we sometimes use the word goen. It's used colloquially in Japanese to just mean like, "Dare to goen arimasu ne," or like you have some kind of connection with somebody, but it's a little bit deeper. It comes from in-en, and in Sanskrit, paticca samutpada, this idea of like causes and conditions that bring people together or things together. And it's a kind of like mysterious thing. Sometimes, like the subject of today's talk and this book, American Sutra, about Buddhism and the World War II Japanese American incarceration, it's not something that I would have without meeting this diary, have probably produced a book like this, let alone taken 17 years to do it. It's because, I think Yusho didn't quite mention this fact that I'm not actually trained as a scholar of Japanese American history or World War II history. I'm a scholar of Buddhism first and foremost, and in Japan studies. So this book is a little bit unusual for me, and I'm not properly trained in it, as I said. And my background was working with a scholar of Buddhist studies at Harvard called Masatoshi Nagatomi. And it was at the end of finishing up my dissertation when he suddenly passed away. And when that happened, the professor's wife asked me to help the family kind of clear out anything in the office that looked personal. And just, I think he was such a great scholar of Buddhism. He began in 1958 at Harvard and all the way through the 90s. And he had this amazing collection of Tibetan and Sanskrit and classical Chinese and Japanese books. So the family wanted to gift it to a library. And so they were like, can you pull out anything personal? So I went into his office, and I found, and this is on the slide on your, on your left is one portion of these yellow pieces of paper that I found stuck in between, it was like in between some dissertation chapter drafts and some correspondence, was a pile of these pieces of paper. And it had the name of my professor, Nagatomi, the family name, on it, but I could tell the handwriting wasn't, I used to have to read it wasn't the same. And I would come to discover that it was a diary written by his father, Reverend Shinso Nagatomi, in a place called Manzanar. And living in Los Angeles now, it's kind of like everyone knows what Manzanar is, one of the 10 large camps that during World War II incarcerated nearly 110,000 persons in these large camps. It's one of the well-known camps, but I'm ashamed to say that when I first looked at these pieces of paper about a diary being written behind barbed wire by somebody who, my professor's father was a Buddhist priest. He was a Reverend Shinso Nagatomi, quite well-known priest. He had written this thing, and I didn't know anything. It was kind of shameful, but I grew up in Tokyo, in Japan, and in high school, we didn't learn anything about Japanese Americans during World War II and things like that. So I'd gotten all the way through college and grad school, and I still didn't really have very much of a clue. And I'd be reading these phrases like "mesuhoru," like "what's a mess hall," and things like that. And the family asked me, "Could you translate? Just translate from Japanese into English?" And that I was like, "That I can do, hopefully, if I can get through understanding what is a barrack and mess hall and all these kind of words from World War II." And it was so embarrassing to me as I was trying to translate this, not knowing anything, that I just began. So that was the beginning of the 17 years. I just spent like 5 years reading every book, memoir, article, PhD dissertation ever written about the World War II Japanese American experience, both in the camps, in the free zones, what happened under martial law in Hawaii, what happened in the U.S. military, for example, about Fort Snelling here in Minnesota. I just tried to read everything I could. And what I ended up learning along the way became the basis for this book. But it kind of all began with this diary, because I would go in, I wouldn't translate the whole diary right away, and I would go in and give Mrs. Nagatomi, my professor's wife, like a few pages at a time. And over the course of maybe 4 different visits, she told me a little bit about what happened with her family. She lived, unlike my professor who was born and raised in Japan, although his parents were in camp, he was in Japan at the time of the war. She was born and raised in Madera, California, in the Central Valley. A lot of Japanese Americans working in agriculture there. And her parents were from Japan, Wakayama Prefecture, but she was born and raised there. And she told me that right after Pearl Harbor, she was 11 years old. She came back from school one day, and she saw this scene where at the farmhouse, at the door, her dad was being beaten by some men in suits. And her mom was sitting really still at the kitchen table with somebody pointing a shotgun to her mom's head. And though she was 11, she knew she had to kind of not be fearful and just walk right into this situation because she knew she had to translate. Her parents barely spoke any English, and clearly these men in suits didn't speak any Japanese. And so she did that, and she would, after some conversation, it became clear that these men in suits were special agents from the FBI, and that they said that they were there because her dad was on some kind of FBI watch list. They were on some kind of list because he was a senior officer of the Buddhist Association in Madera, California. She explained that to her parents, and her parents explained that her dad had been out in the lettuce fields with a shotgun because there were some rabbits or something so he was trying to scare them off. And unfortunately, that was the very moment when the FBI cars rolled in, and they thought they were under threat or something. Anyway, once all that got cleared up, the FBI agent said, we'll come back tomorrow and continue talking to you. And in fact, they would come back several more times in the course of December 1941. But after that first visit, the dad said, look, they seem to suspect that we're some kind of like we're spies or like national security, just because we're Buddhist, you know. But, you know, our daughter, we're American, we've been here for a decade, like, we have to prove that we belong here. And so he built a fire, and after scouring the house, looking for anything that was had something like made in Japan or had kanji or Japanese characters on it. And for her, as an 11-year-old girl, the worst thing was he got the entire, it's called Hinamatsuri Ningyo, like these Girls' Day doll collection. And he got all of that and threw that into the fire. And, you know, as a kind of, I guess, way of symbolically, erasing or burning away their Japaneseness. And he said he had this last set of things he was going to throw in the fire, but then he hesitated. And his daughter said, she reported to me, she said, you know, what could be like more important than my dolls? And he explained that he had a sutra, a Buddhist scripture that had been handed down generations and generations in his family, and he didn't feel like he could just throw that into the fire. And because he was the head secretary of the Madera Buddhist Association, he had all the temple records from the establishment all the way up to December 1941. He's like, this is a record of our community's history, and it's not my personal property to burn. So he didn't throw those two things into the fire. Instead, he got a box, found the large back hole, dug a hole right near a large tree at the garage, and buried it. In this tin box, he buried a Buddhist sutra and Californian, Buddhist temple history. As many families, they had to sell their farm for 1/20th of the market value after they got these orders to report to a civil control station and go to some camp, a destination unknown for a time indefinite. And so they had, a week or so to do it, and so they could only get 1/20th of its market value. And after the war, when they came back, the new owners told them, look, we will only sell it back to you, this farm, your home, if you pay the market rate. They didn't have that money, They had some relatives in LA, so they said, look, we'll head down to LA, but the dad was like, I want to find that box. But unfortunately, during the war, the new owners had torn down the garage and cut down all the large trees on the farm. So he roughly knew where it was, but that kind of X marks the spot. It was kind of gone. So dig as he might, he never found it. So somewhere in the soil of California lies Buddhist teachings, the sutras, and temple history. And to me, this was kind of the story, as I started on this journey of 17 years of research and writing and interviewing 120 people. I think ultimately I interviewed camp survivors and war veterans and so forth, and translated diaries and declassified tens of thousands of documents at the National Archives. That story always stuck with me. A story of a family, a Buddhist family, saying, we might burn away our Japaneseness to say that we belong, but we're not going to burn away our faith. It says something about what America is, what America's religious freedom means, and what one Buddhist family did to try to reenact that. There are a lot of buried stories, and I'm going to try to do a few of them in the course of my time here before I think we have a panel discussion with some two very distinguished local guests. I'm sorry, I'll start here. So, as I mentioned, as I was reading this literature about what happened during World War II, you would come to learn about the 10 big camps, all of these assembly centers, euphemistically called, places that people went to initially as temporary confinement sites, all of these Department of Justice and Army-run high-security camps for people who are arrested right away after Pearl Harbor. I would learn about all of these different, many different camps. But what I didn't expect to learn, what I would find that I try to write and highlight in the book, was the role that Buddhism in particular and religion in general played in both why people were forcibly removed and put into camps, but also how people used their faith, used their Buddhism to persist and survive. On top left here, you see Reverend Asada Shoryu from Shingonji in Honolulu being arrested. One of the first things I learned in my research at the National Archives was that even before the smoke had cleared at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the very first person arrested at 3 p.m. that day, by 3:30, martial law was declared. So even before martial law was declared, the first person the FBI picked up was Reverend Gikyo Kuchiba, a Buddhist priest of the Nishihonganji Temple. Second person picked up, a Buddhist priest of my sect of Buddhism, Soto Zen Buddhist priest. You'd think like, if you have a war situation, maybe you'd pick up consular officials or, what? So that was one of my first, why were Buddhist priests considered such assets or important persons to be rounded up? And how did it all begin? And I would come to learn that as far back as 1938, the FBI, the ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the Army G2, military intelligence, had been compiling reports of what to do in case of war with Japan, how to declare martial law, how to shut down radio stations and other ethnic press, and most importantly, how to have a registry or a list of people to arrest and how to rank them and classify them in order of dangerousness. And they would do these reports about the relative loyalty of Buddhists versus Christians in the Japanese American community. And they would come eventually to put Buddhist priests and Shinto priests, but not Christian ministers, at the top of the list. As I was researching, now it became clear why my professor's wife's father, even though he's not even a minister, like he's not a clergyman, he was still tainted with a connection to something that the intelligence agencies of the time considered un-American, or maybe even anti-American, a threat to American national security. So, for example, you see here, Group A, Group B, Group C. This is a file from the FBI file of Reverend Miyamoto from Haleiwa in Hawaii. He's picked up, of course, right away after Pearl Harbor on December the 8th. This is his FBI file, basic personnel record. And so across both Hawaii and the continental United States, there was a sweep that happened right after Pearl Harbor, and Buddhist priests were caught in it. And as I went to research why this view of Buddhism as a kind of danger to America, I began to realize that they had this long history. It's a history that goes as far back as 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. At that time, and that's the first federal, immigration law. America before 1882, like anyone could there wasn't a Department of Homeland Security or immigration naturalization, and there weren't green cards or visa. People just came. But in 1882, America decided for the first time that a certain group of people needed to be targeted for exclusion. And that's the name of the law, the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed by Congress. And the rhetoric of that time, talking about the heathen Chinese, that was the kind of slur word used towards the Chinese, to talk about a people who were racially unassimilable, but also religiously, by being not Christian heathen, unwelcome to America. And they would have these these pamphlets about the Chinese invasion and a heathen Chinese despotism that might be established if too many of these Chinese come to the country, the need to build a Chinese wall, symbolically on the Pacific. And to your right, I think you'll see this is from Harper's Magazine, 1895, an image in a very popular magazine about the Yellow Peril. You can see a group of people representing Western civilization and peoples with a cross above it, and in the distance, this ominous yellow peril, this Asian kind of invasion coming, symbolized by this dark cloud with a Buddha coming towards and invading America. And in 1943, during World War II, you see on your left a similar image of a Japanese, warrior, like samurai warrior, on top of a, military tank with a Buddha, kind of like all fused, conflated together. It was only after I started researching all these that I began to realize, today Oprah interviews Thich Nhat Hanh and Dalai Lama, like mindfulness is at Google. We're in a different age. Because back then, Buddhism was not viewed in that kind of favorable way in American life in general, or American religious culture in particular. And after that initial roundup comes, in February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt's issuance of Executive Order 9066. It's the executive order that leads to the mass incarceration, primarily to those 10 big camps I mentioned earlier, of everyone living on the west coast of the United States. And by everyone, I mean everyone of Japanese ancestry. Being mixed Japanese myself, I was always curious, did they also pick up people who were half Japanese or quarter? What was the rule? And back in those days, California had an anti-miscegenation law. People couldn't intermarry racially, And so a lot of little babies who may have come from such unions, they were given up for adoption And there were these orphanages in LA, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. And at one of them, after that executive order came by, the orphanage director was paid a visit by one of the chief architects of this mass incarceration, later Colonel Carl Bendiston. He was asked, are these little babies and 10-year-olds and little children who may be also mixed Japanese, are they also subject to Executive Order 9066? And the answer Bendiston gave, and this is his words, not mine, was that if they have a single drop of Japanese blood in them, I want them in camp. So that's what happened. It didn't matter if you're a little baby orphan, an infirmed grandmother, if you're an American citizen or a Japanese national, if you had a drop of Japanese blood, the army was ruling that you were a threat to national security. This community was, at that time, the largest Buddhist community in the United States, and predominantly viewed as because it was a predominantly Buddhist community, in that way. And Bendiston's boss, Lieutenant General John DeWitt, in 1943 writes a report called the Final Report, which he submits to Congress, in which he articulates why it was necessary to suddenly remove all of these people from the West Coast. And he says in his report, it's because they are tied, he calls the Japanese American community a menace, again, not my word, his word, menace tied to the enemy nation by race, culture, customs, and religion. In other words, the fact that this group of people were not majority Christian made them, in his view, a threat. One that was so threatening, apparently, that you had to take little babies and infirm grandma, everybody, out of the West Coast. And so they left, often given a week, 10 days notice to, if you're, like, for example, if you're a college student here, to disenroll from classes. If you were a farmer, to sell your farm. If you're a business owner, to sell your business, and where you're going to store everything. Like, you're given very little time, and so people had to sell their things at almost nothing. They had to figure out what to do with their lives, in which they didn't know where they're going, for how long, and you can only take what you can carry. So that means you scour your apartment or house with a single suitcase, trying to figure out what are you going to put in that, given that kind of condition. Is it going to be cold, hot? How long? You don't know. So it was that people arrived initially at these euphemistically called assembly centers. Often, like for example in LA, you would have gone to Santa Anita Racetrack. It was a horse, or Tanforan Racetrack. And if you're in San Francisco, this is a picture of Puyallup in Washington State, 30 miles south of Seattle, where all the Washingtonians went, just the county fairgrounds. You were living suddenly in a place that livestock or horses, they may have put down some fresh, planks of wood, but the smell of manure, and it's not going to go, So suddenly you're in that circumstance with that suitcase. And one of the things, as people entered these initial camps, was that it's almost like when you go to prison or something. They search, they check you for contraband, and announcements were made, not only about obvious things like you can't bring a gun in or even a camera, because obviously they were worried about espionage or something. But they were like anything written in Japanese, like a book written in Japanese, any bound material in Japanese, like a Buddhist Sutra or even a book of Japanese poetry, was considered contraband. There were two exceptions to this. If you had an English-Japanese dictionary or a Christian Bible in Japanese, that was okay. So what was the message people were getting from their government at that time? The Japanese bit is okay only if you assimilate into English speaking and assimilate into Christianity, right? That somehow everything else is lesser of something that doesn't belong in America. But as with the story of that family that buried those sutras and temple history, not every Buddhist family accepted what the government said. In Portland, Oregon, this is the family of Reverend Tansai Teraka of the Oregon Buddhist Church, his daughter Hiroko, and she's playing checkers with her friend Lillian Hayashi. They clearly were able to bring in enough things that made their it's still, that place still exists, Assembly Center. It's the Portland International Livestock and Expo Center. And they were able to transform their kind of like animal kind of livestock cell into something somewhat, a little bit decent and have some dignity in a place like this. But the other thing you might notice is that on the wall, they put up an American flag and a Buddha photo, claiming that despite what the government is saying, for example, with its contraband policy, that you could be both Buddhist and American at the same time. And so once the people moved to the large camps, that moment of dislocation, of loss, it's not surprising that Christians may turn to their Christian faith, Buddhists may turn to their Buddhist faith, to try to make sense of how to orient oneself in this very difficult moment. They could only take that suitcase, so many people didn't have things like these prayer beads, or what they call in Japanese, ojizu. This particular one made in one camp by a Buddhist priest who was in one of the high security camps. They had the Geneva Convention rules governing that camp, and so they could get one piece of fruit per week. He kept enough peach pits to make that. In the larger camps, you can see in the lower right, this is mid-construction, an altar, somewhere where you could recreate Buddhist life again by having a central altar. And in that particular camp, it was amazing. They had, the Nishiura brothers, are really skilled craftsmen who built the San Jose Buddhist Temple, etc. So they took anything they could find, desert wood, scrap wood from the, cartons from the mess hall, and made a beautiful altar. But not all camps were lucky. They didn't have carpenters or desert wood or anything. But one of the big rituals, you can see it here in this photo in Heart Mountain, they had this main statue and altar and this little one with the baby Buddha statue in it, surrounded by flowers. It's for what's called Flower Festival or Hana Matsuri, the Buddha's birthday ceremony. And that's one of the big rituals in Buddhist life, and many people wanted to do it. And here you can see, usually in that ritual, you honor the birth of the Buddha and the legend that when he was born, the heavens were so happy it rained flowers and sweet rain. By ritually pouring sweet tea on the baby Buddha's head in this flower-encased shrine. That's what people do on the Buddha's birthday. But in one of the camps I studied, in one of the diaries I translated, it talked about how they didn't have any of these. They didn't have a Buddha statue, they didn't have flowers, they're in the middle of the desert. So they went to a toilet and got some toilet paper, some beads from the mess hall, dyed the paper, and used kind of like origami folding techniques to make some flowers. They didn't have sweet tea, but they had army rationed coffee and sugar, so they made some sweet coffee drink. One of the young YBA, or Young Buddhist Association members, found the largest carrot that he could find and carved a semblance of a Buddha statue out of it and poured that sweet, so everyone would pour sweet coffee on the carrot Buddha. So that's how people they kind of like took what the government said about you don't belong here, whether on race or religion, and found a way to be able to persist, survive, and be creative about doing so. And in the end, the government had to, in some sense, accept that Buddhists were a part of this community. I call it the triface of Buddhist, Protestant, Catholic. Every one of these large camps got some kind of space for these faith communities to gather. The war against fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and militaristic Japan was being prosecuted by President Roosevelt based on the idea of American democracy and what he called the four freedoms, including the freedom of religion. And so it would be too ironic if they could, if the majority group within the Japanese American community was denied a place in these camps to be able to gather and practice their faith. But behind the scenes, even while this was going on, the government produced something called the Leave Clearance Form. It's sometimes colloquially known as the Loyalty Questionnaire. And if you answer to certain questions, like question 27 and 28, in the wrong way, if you said yes or no, or like if you answer wrong, you were segregated out and sent to a special segregation camp. So that's what that questionnaire is most well known for, as a way to kind of determine loyalty. But one of the questions, question 16, is about religion. And if you answered that question on religion and said you were a Christian, you got +2 points. If you answered Shinto, you were denied automatically leave clearance. You're completely deemed unloyal. And if you answered Buddhist, you got -1 point. It always struck me as an odd way of measuring loyalty, because if you're an actual spy or intending to commit sabotage, you just say Christian, like you try to get out. So it doesn't make any sense, but that's what they did. Behind the scenes, there's always some evaluation by the United States government that Buddhists were still and continued to be a threat to national security. I want to end this part of the talk by talking about the concept of this interlinked thing. It's based on a sermon I translated by one of the Hawaii Buddhist priests that went to camp. He was also in April. Buddha's birthday happens in April every year. He was asked to give a Buddhist Dharma message at this ceremony, and he was noting the fact that he was arrested on December 7th, 1941. It was a Sunday. So the FBI arrested him in his robes. And he mentioned the fact that here it was in April 1942, and they had arrested him at the temple and never let him go back home, even to get a suitcase. So he was wearing the same clothes as he was on December 7th. And he was noting how dusty and dirty his robes had become. And then he alluded to this metaphor. It's a classic Buddhist one about the lotus flower blossoming above muddy water. In Buddhist teachings, they use this metaphor to talk about the idea that the muddy waters represents the world of suffering, the world of delusion, the world of ego, the world of all these kind of different things that make life difficult. And that how the Buddhist practice and pathway is to rise up above it like a lotus flower would. And like if you look at a regular Buddhist, the Buddha's always sitting on a lotus pedestal. It's supposed to the lotus flower is supposed to represent the Buddha's awakening, his enlightenment, his freedom, his liberation. And so it was the metaphor is kind of like this idea of rising up, But what he said was very interesting. He said, look, it's not that it's wrongly understood if you think the Buddhism and real faith life is about trying to escape, trying to run away from the muddy waters. Because if you put lotus flowers in clean or sterile water, it won't grow. It needs the mud for the nutrition to grow. And just so, this dirtied robe is also giving me the nutrition to practice my faith all the values and virtues of patience and compassion, wisdom better because of this circumstance. It was an interesting sermon for him to have given, and one that, in this, this is one of the things that happened after my book came out. People read it. Sometimes people send me comments, but one Buddhist priest didn't send me any comments. He just sent me this painting that he did. And it's a lotus flower, in muddy water. But the pond looks a little bit like America, and there's some barbed wire. But that's what he got out of it. I have exactly 3 minutes, so I'm going to try to say something about how that history and how being interlinked to what is happening in real life and religious, how that's connected to today. I think many of you know that today we still have some of that rhetoric. Sometimes it's about religion, like the heathen, whether it's a travel ban that seems to be directed in one direction, or what's happening on the southern border, initially using that kind of idea of separating children from their families as a deterrence initiative, people trying to seek asylum, legally trying to seek asylum, not being afforded hearings, living in inhumane conditions without toothpaste, and all those things. It reminded me, because I translated all these diaries about people going into some of these camps initially and not being afforded any kind of soap or toothpaste. I would hear about, and so our times, these issues about exclusion based on either religion or race, it seems like it's an enduring question mark in American life. Just like that comment I made about, you don't never know what happens when your book comes out. I found out that there was a group of Japanese Americans, they call themselves Tsuru for solidarity. Tsuru means like cranes, Japanese word for like the bird crane. And they began last year, they would fold like origami style paper cranes and take them to these detention facilities on the border and elsewhere, saying back when we were, children, they're all like, many of the elders are like 90 some years old now. They were like, back when World War II, nobody, or very few people, there were some, but very few people spoke up about what was happening. Very few people, wrote a letter to the editor or certainly protested, but they were like, we're going to stand up for these people, especially the children that have been separated from their families. As they started going to places like Dilley, Texas, a place that held the largest number of, it still holds the largest number of these unaccompanied children. And what I would learn about my book, so here's a photo of Dilley, Texas, is that one of the co-founders of this movement, she took the color photocopy of the cover of my book and made some cranes out of it and started placing them on these fences. And so, just because of my limitation, I'm going to try to wrap up, but this has begun for me, I don't know whether it's the next 17 years or not, but I was like, I know so little about the difference between Border Patrol custody and, Department of Human Services and ICE detentions. And so I've been trying to, since last year, begin the process of educating myself to understand what's happening today may not be that different than what happened to Japanese Americans back in World War II. I think one of the Buddhist priests here, we went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, former World War II Japanese American I should just say internment site, that the Trump administration was intending to move 1,400 of the kids. And back in World War II, several men, I knew about this camp because 90 of the 700 people who were in that camp were Buddhist priests. And I read in one diary how they had to perform a funeral for 3 men who died, 2 of them killed by guards, one at the fence of this place at Fort Sill. And so that motivated me to request other Buddhist priests to come out and maybe show our moral, support for having more humane conditions and having a better process and thinking about these issues, not necessarily from a political, partisan way, but just about human dignity and decency. And so various Buddhist priests came to join Sutra for Solidarity, join some 400 or so Latinx dreamers, high school and college-age students. And in this case, we managed to apparently, usually you don't protest and you think like A equals B, but in this case, the optics look so bad about placing these children, I think, in these former World War II camps that the Oklahoma governor and others put some pressure on the White House, and that policy was stopped. But the journey goes on, and these issues continue, and I just wanted to just close by saying, in June of this year, we're intending to take 125,000 cranes to Washington, D.C., to place them on the fence of the White House this time. And I think these type of, interlinked stories, histories about what happened back then in World War II, what's happening today, what happened to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and what's happening today. These are all part of one big story about what is America. Is America essentially a white Christian nation? Or is America a multi-ethnic and religiously free nation? To me, that's the question that all of us are faced with today. Thank you.
We've invited 2 local Japanese-American Buddhists to have conversations with Duncan, but mainly to tell stories about the local context. So we've invited Tat Tsuchiya and Gail Wang of the Twin Cities Buddhist Association. And I just, very basic question that I wanted to pose to both Todd and Gail, which is about sort of extending Duncan Williams' talk about the survival and persistence of Buddhism, but how the teachings of Buddhism survived and persisted. So I wanted to basically have you tell stories about how teachings of Buddhism survived and persisted after camps, and their family members have been long-standing members of the local Japanese American community that really sort of took hold here during and then after the war. So I wanted to turn to Todd Tsuchiya and then also Gail Wang to share some of those stories.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for really opening the eyes of that particular lens of evaluation of the whole experience. But Gail and I are members of the Twin Cities Buddhist Association, which is a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist tradition. It's part of the Pure Land tradition. And we are part of the organization that Professor Williams' book does talk about. It's significantly intertwined in the incarceration history of the story. So Gail and I'm ordained in the Buddhist, the Jodo Shinshu tradition, and the immigration history, how that was formatted. Many areas of Japan where the majority of the immigrants came from were primarily Jodo Shinshu. So there was a large population of Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, and so that's where in Professor Williams' book talks about the organization that started the Buddhist mission in North America back in 1898, I believe it was, and which is now still in existence today, which is what we are a part of. But during the World War II experience, they had met in Topaz in Utah to reformat or redevelop the organization, and they changed the name of it to Buddhist Churches of America to make it more American. And that is the name that as it exists today. A couple of real quick personal stories. My grandmother kept a journal, a very detailed journal, and it was relatively recently translated for us. So it was very enlightening to see some of her stories. She talked about, in our Buddhist tradition, it's important to have a home altar. And she didn't take it. They didn't take it with them to the camp. But she was very moved by the generosity of somebody, one of her friends in the camp, who had, with scrap material, made a home altar for her family. Another story of our particular family is an uncle who was able to be released from camp early to Minnesota, and he had a sponsor, he had a job, but in order for that person to take him to come out of camp, he had to convert. That was a stipulation of his leaving and be able to be accepted. So he readily did. He just wanted to get out of camp so desperately. The Twin Cities experience, of course, a lot of the Japanese Americans who came to the Twin Cities were related to the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service at Fort Snelling, which I know many of you or most of you are somewhat familiar. So that's not the only reason a lot of the population is here, but that was a significant number of the Japanese Americans. And during that time, there was an Episcopal priest. His name was Reverend Daisuke Kitagawa, who is mentioned in Professor Williams' book. And he was here, and he encouraged the Buddhist group to form a community. And so what they did was they reached out to the parent organization, the Buddhist Churches of America, and there was a minister, the closest minister in the Midwest was actually in Chicago. His name was Reverend Yodo Kono. And he was a minister who was released early from the Rower camp in Arkansas to come to Chicago. So he helped form a number of communities in the Midwest, Minneapolis being, the Twin Cities being one of them. And one of the stories about him is that he was highly scrutinized during that time as well, and he had to meet with the FBI weekly to submit his sermons so that they could review it before he could give it. But he helped our group organize here. I have copies of the original signature list of the bylaws and constitution of our organization. There's 49 on that list. And I was reviewing it the other day, and there's still a couple of those members who are still around today. But most of them have since passed away. And communities that have really helped us were the Unitarian Church was very vital in helping us organize and get together. And I guess I'll turn it over to Gail for more information about how our path has been.
Well, to give you a little background on my family, my parents, their families were very devout Buddhists. My mother was born in Stockton, California, before she was interned in the Stockton Assembly Center and then sent to Rower, Arkansas. Her parents were from Aichiken, Japan, and my grandmother came over as a picture bride. My dad's family, his mother was from the Ida family, apparently was a well-to-do Otera family or temple family in Fukuoka. There were 10 siblings. 2 of them were born in Japan, but Dad was born in Fort Lupton, Colorado. And he moved to California, San Diego, with some of his brothers and sisters and was there with his mother and several of the siblings. But rather than being interned in camp, the family decided to return to Denver. And but Dad, who had been in the Army, he was discharged because of his age. Right after Pearl Harbor, he was recalled into the service, and so he ended up in Minnesota at Fort Snelling, where he was a medic. He eventually was in MIS language school. And my mom and Dad met because Dad was on furlough. He went to go visit friends in Rower, Arkansas, and friends encouraged my mother to talk to Frank, and he offered to help her get set up in St. Paul. She was on her way to Chicago because there were jobs available in Chicago. She decided to come to St. Paul. She said she had no idea where Minnesota even was on the map, but she came to St. Paul, and they eventually got married and settled here. But Dad was very interested in organizing a Buddhist community here, and he helped the group get organized. They held their first Buddhist service here May 5th, 1946, at a Unitarian church in Minneapolis. They started a Sunday school about in 1950, and my oldest sister, Emmy, was one of the first students, along with Al Ono and his sister, Marlene. And that Sunday school, which we called Sunday school at that time, rather nowadays we call it Dharma school, but it was called Sunday school. It was started by Reverend Philip Eidman, who was a Buddhist minister. He was a war vet. He was confined to a wheelchair, but he helped teach Sunday school at that point. We had a Japanese American Community Center on 2200 Blaisdell that various groups used at that point.
Yeah, I have a newspaper clipping from that era, the early 50s, that lists the group. It was a joint venture. It's actually owned, I think, by the Diocese of Minnesota, the Episcopal Diocese of Minnesota. And so the Buddhist group and the Episcopal group would meet there. So the article showed a picture of the two priests, the Buddhist altar with a cross on top. And so they would use the same worship room for that. But the article also talked about other groups that used it, and I thought it was very interesting. So there was a group called the American Indians Incorporated that also used the facility, something called the Rainbow Club, which is a multi-ethnic social club, and also United Citizens League, which was the original name of the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League, which of course works against racial discrimination. Another person who was very intimately involved was, some of you longtimers might know as Father Otani, who was a very important figure in the Japanese Christian church.
So the JCC Center closed in 1965. The building was torn down, and I think there are apartment buildings there. But I have great memories of bazaars and Halloween parties and various community activities taking place there. There was a basement where we had a Hanamatsuri plays every year, and lots of Japanese food I remember from the Issei ladies. But it closed in '65, and so the Buddhist church had no place to meet. And so my dad went on a venture to try to find a place for our group to meet. And somehow he connected with George Shea, who was an assistant professor of Japanese language and literature here at the University of Minnesota. And George and his partner, Gordon Loxley, owned a very posh and popular beauty salon called the Red Carpet Beauty Salon. And they offered us to use the beauty school to hold our Sunday school. And so for a long time we met there. Gordon Loxley, by the way, was a very well-known celebrity here in town and an art collector. And he was known for throwing very lavish parties at his Mount Curve mansion. Mr. Shea and Mr. Loxley were very generous in loaning their very impressive contemporary art collection to MIA, the Minneapolis Institute of Art. They eventually tore that school down. It was located on Nicollet Mall. I think it was at the time where the Nicollet Mall was being built. And so we were on search again to find another place to meet. And Dad was able to secure the Minneapolis School of Business on 10th Street. And so instead of sitting under hair dryers, and we were sitting with typewriters and adding machines. But eventually we were able to use the facility at the First Universalist Church on 5000 Girard. And through the kindness and generosity of Reverend Cummings there, we met for many years, having Sunday school there on Sundays, as well as using the facility for Saturday night services. And present day, we are meeting at the YWCA on Lake Street with connections from Joyce Yamamoto has been able to let us use that facility, and we're still meeting there.
Just one more comment, if I can just emphasize again that the Fort Snelling connection was a big connection for the Japanese American community who resettled here. I didn't mention before, I have an uncle on both sides of my family that were stationed there, which is why their families came to Minnesota. I mean, both families were farming families, and they lost everything, so they had nothing to go back to in California. So this was the place for them to come, and they were more accepted here.
I think what's amazing to me, especially listening to Duncan's story, that the courage that it took to build a Buddhist community here, and just that we've survived this long. And I think a lot of people aren't aware of the Jodo Shinshu community here, but we haven't had a permanent building, we haven't had a permanent resident minister here, but we've persevered for over 74 years here in the Twin Cities. And through great support from Sangha members who have kept it all together. But we did have various ministers who came to the University of Minnesota through graduate school, stayed and helped support us. We had Reverend Yuri Kyogoku, who was here in the 60s, Reverend Yakumu, who was here in the later 60s, who eventually married my sister Emmy's roommate, and other ministers who helped to support us.
Thank you all. We have about 20 minutes, but I do want to open up so we can have a Q&A session with panelists here. But I'm just reminded of the power of faith. I don't go to churches. I'm not a Buddhist or anything like that. But there's something really kind of contagious about that, and the notion that the Duncan offered, interlinked, and I'm kind of fixated right now, and it does cross boundaries at the local level. And I've done a little bit of research about Japanese American resettlement here locally, but really different people, religious backgrounds, racial, ethnic backgrounds, sort of crisscrossed, and in that process of crisscrossing, groups like, I think now that I'm hearing this story, the Twin Cities Buddhist Association was able to go on building their community and then also to practice their faith. And one person in particular that I've been looking at is actually a First Unitarian Church member. You might have heard of it, Genevieve Stiefel. Stiefel, you've ever heard of it? No. She was very instrumental in organizing the Japanese American resettlement community in Minneapolis, and worked very, very closely with Daisuke Kitagawa, the Episcopalian leader who helped to create this Japanese American Community Center on Blaisdell. But anyway, so I just wanted to put that out there, just an incredible sort of power of faith and its shaping power. But anyway, I wanted to open up for questions and comments. A lot of community members are here too, so they can certainly impart more knowledge, and I'll maybe go around and kind of give you the microphone so you can talk.
You mentioned going back to 1938, the U.S. government was exploring putting a strategy in place to investigate Buddhist priests and things like that. Do you think the incarceration strategy would have taken place without the war, because of that strategy starting before the war?
Sorry,
Would there have been an incarceration in place even without a war?
Right. So thank you for your question. When the commission, when in hindsight, historians have looked at why were not all Italian Americans rounded up, or not all German Americans, like why were only those of Japanese ancestry targeted? The usual answer is that question of like what the commission report said, which is the racial animus of the time, lack of political leadership, and war hysteria. And I've always been a little bit worried about that thing about war hysteria, because it makes it sound like people were just hysterical because war was, and that's why the camps happened. But what I noticed by looking at these things before the war was just how well planned and how well, clearly articulated it was about who's a danger, who's not, what categories, all of these things, surveillance and intelligence records about people. It didn't seem like it was completely like, oh, we've been attacked at Pearl Harbor, we're going to have a little bit of hysteria and round everybody up. It was kind of pre-thought through, what would the steps be in case of war with Japan. President Roosevelt, as you may well know, he was previously Secretary of Navy, and prior to, almost as far back as after the Russo-Japanese War, and certainly by World War I, those people who served in the Navy had already been thinking about a potential war with Japan. In the case of Roosevelt, while he was Secretary of the Navy, he had even written up a plan, and he uses the word concentration camp, but he says if we have a war with Japan, we need to create concentration camps. And in this case, he was talking about Hawaii, but for example, rounding up all the Japanese and putting them on the island of Molokai and things like that. So he had already, prior to him becoming president, had some thinking about the need to contain and confine people as a strategy of defense. And so to that extent, I feel like, and it wasn't just him, there were many others who in the military intelligence circles as well as the civilian agencies had been doing some planning.
I have a question, two-part question. What did your publishers make you take out of the book? And secondly, what can we anticipate with all the data that's in your brain from 17 years of research coming down the pipe with future publications?
Well, let me answer that second one first. I had a manuscript about 4 and a bit years ago. I thought I was done, but it was 700 pages. And so the publisher said, you need to cut that in half, otherwise nobody will buy your book. And, so that's one part of the answer is a lot of the things about the lead up to the war, all the things that happened before about, you're talking about Fort Snelling and about the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service. Japanese Americans served in a segregated, distinguished unit in the European theater, but also lesser known about how they served in the Pacific as translators, prisoner interrogators, code breakers, people listening on radio, all the things that people who trained here in Minnesota at the Military Intelligence Service Language School did in the Pacific was said by Willoughby, one of the important generals, that saved over 1 million American lives and shortened the war by 2 years. But the irony of that is that before the war, both in Hawaii, territorial government, but California, Washington State, they had these campaigns to close down Japanese language schools primarily run by Buddhist temples. In the case of Hawaii, they actually passed a territorial law to do that. The Buddhists responded and took it to court, territorial court, Ninth Circuit, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1927, Farrington versus Tokushige. The Supreme Court says, what are you doing, Hawaii? That's not constitutional to disfavor religion or language just because. So those language schools survived. The irony of a group of Japanese Americans leaving behind their siblings, their parents, and behind barbed wire, serving their country, using their Japanese language skills, which had almost been shut down, to understand some of those things that happened in that pre-war period, I had this whole long section. That's what I cut from the book. So what I'm doing right now is conceiving of a prequel and a sequel. A sequel that'll bring us all the way up to where we are today, but also this prequel that starts back in, like from the Chinese Exclusion Act up to World War II. And let me just add one last thing. I was told by one of the editors, that he was like, Yamamoto, Yamakura, Yamanishi. He was like, there's too many Japanese names. It's so confusing. I can't keep track of them. Can you boil it down to 7 main characters? But part of this kind of work of historical recovery, interviewing these families, they're sharing their diaries and personal history, family histories. I was like, that would just erase them once again, right? And so the compromise, so American Sutra, I try to do it where sometimes I'll say, somebody who owned a grocery store on the blah, 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 and I may have reduced the number of names, but I wanted to retain it with, you'll notice like this book has a massive endnote section. It's all in there. Their names are retained in there. That's the reason why some people find it bothersome. Why is there such a big, but it's because I wanted to make sure these families and their histories and their lives, that they're actually a kind, the reason I called it American Sutra usually means like the Buddhist teachings, but it's these people's lives itself that's teaching us something. And so you want to keep their names. And so that's why, anyway, that's to explain the length of the book and how I structured it.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate both your book and the talk. It's very emotional for me to listen to you. I actually have a PhD from the School of Religion at USC, but from a very long time ago when things are really different. And in my experience, and especially academia, there is this idea that like the white scholars had the real Buddhism, and when they talked about Japanese American or Chinese American Buddhism, it was like just ethnic Buddhism. They would make fun of things like changing the name to the Buddhist Churches of America without any understanding of what was going on. So I was just wondering about your work within academia and also with different places where people practice, how you are seeing any changes in all of that.
There's a national Buddhist magazine called Tricycle. And I'll share this because I think she wouldn't mind at this point. But the founding editor of it, I won't name names, but the founding editor of it, I remember having a conversation with her quite a long time ago now about some of these stories and what I felt were really important kind of historical kind of grounding foundations of American Buddhism, that the Chinese bringing over first, then the Japanese bringing over, like that this Asian American groups often get written out of what is considered American Buddhism in these type of magazines. And I was talking to her about that, and she, at that initial time, she would, and she'd said it several more times too, so it's like, okay. But she was like, it was, American Buddhism didn't exist until the 1970s, that kind of idea. When maybe people like her had converted to Buddhism and Americanized it that way. And it always struck me as just an odd comment, as if like only if you're white are you American, that's the equation of what it means to Americanize Buddhism. And I'm like, no, American Buddhism has been around for like almost 150 years, and they've been around and persisted through difficult times, and to somehow dismiss all of that as some kind of like, oh, that's just some small ethnic Buddhism, that's not real American Buddhism. No, that's actually American Buddhism.
Hi, I am a descendant of Heart Mountain, Jerome, and Gila River. And I just want to thank you first for kind of starting this discussion around religion in my own family, because honestly, religion didn't play a big part in my upbringing, and what I did have generally came from the white side of my family. And so I asked my grandmother and my dad about their experiences with religion, and I didn't even know what their religious affiliations were. And so my grandmother ended up saying that her family had actually been Buddhist, but they basically became like cultural Buddhists by the time that she was born. And it was interesting to hear her talk about like how she kind of like wove in and out of this community. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about not just the people who were very devout practitioners, but the people who maybe identified as Buddhists but didn't necessarily go to temple all the time or church, and how that might have differently affected their experiences with religion in camp.
I think it's just as 125,000 roughly persons of Japanese ancestry, U.S. citizens, Japanese nationals, Peruvian, different people were incarcerated. Just as there's that many people, there's that many stories. So one of the things I always try to caution against is like, just because I've tried to articulate some patterns I've seen, it's not like there's lots of different experiences, and amongst them is a difference, as you just noted, between, let's say, people who really use the Buddhism to orient for kind of ethics or life, or how they might structure their day and so forth, and others for whom the Buddhist association was a kind of more like a social or cultural kind of association. At that time, before the war, the temple often was the only place that people could feel like safe to, like there's certain towns that Japanese people couldn't go to watch a movie. They wouldn't allow, only whites can go to certain movie theaters, so they would experience these kind of things. So they used the temple as a place where they could watch movies or have sports associations and clubs. I guess especially basketball, Japanese are a little bit shorter, so they wanted their own club. So there's partly they wanted their own club, partly they were excluded from other things. And so they had all of these kind of more social sports and other kind of cultural things like taiko and so forth in the temple. And it was a way for families of different generations to transmit culture, food, but also this kind of social life. Especially the young Buddhist Association members, many of them were probably not that devout Buddhist, you know what I mean? But they were they felt something valuable about temple life, about things like obon or hanamatsu, like the kind of community gatherings, bazaars you mentioned, things like that, but also the sports leagues and all of these things may not be that spiritually, religiously inclined, but that's part of what Buddhist temples are supposed to do. It's called, we say Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, 3 treasures or refuges of Buddhism. The temple is supposed to be a refuge. We call it Sankiemo, the 3 kie or refuges. It's supposed to be a refuge. And Sangha means community. How do you build a community? So sometimes you have to do it through music or sports, or they had like busse dances for, high school, college age students. It was a kind of social, communal kind of building project as well. So yes, maybe not as focused on the details of Buddhist doctrine or ritual, but still Buddhism had a value to them. I'm reminded, let me just mention one last thing. I'm reminded of one of the people who served in the U.S. military. He actually wasn't that devout a Buddhist, but it meant something for him to have had these communal Sangha relations, because when he went in, And the induction officer told him, you know, because at that time you could choose a P for Protestant, C for Catholic, H for Hebrew, and an X for other or nothing. And he said, like, I want a B on my dog tag because I'm a Buddhist. And that induction officer told him, son, we don't have Buddhists in the U.S. Army. You got to pick one of these. So he said, okay, I'll pick P. And then that officer said, why did you pick P? Because I protest. So even though he wasn't a devout Buddhist, it still meant something to him, you know.
The question that keeps coming up to my mind, and probably to many others here, is could this happen again? And I recall that during the 80s, when the U.S. was having a lot of problems with Iran, there was a lot of talk about taking Iranians living in this country here and sending them to camps or detention camps. And they kept referring back to what happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II. Fortunately, they never followed through with the Iranians. Maybe that they learned from the Japanese. But I would like to get your thinking on this, if this could happen again.
Thank you for that question. You know, after 9/11, I was talking to the imam at the Honolulu, one of the big mosques in Honolulu. And he told me this story about how after the day after 9/11, this old lady, she was like apparently like 94 years old, started coming towards the evenings to the mosque, and just wasn't doing. She'd just stand or sit outside of the mosque, and she was doing that 2 days in a row. And so he was curious what she was doing, and he asked, and she said, "Well, right after Pearl Harbor, people came to shoot up our temple and have graffiti and that kind of thing, you know, like get Japs go home or some things like that. Incidents happen, and I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen to you." And he didn't know quite how to take it because, on the one hand, she's a 90-some-year-old lady, so he was like, I don't know if she's actually going to be able to prevent some, you know, hooligans or whatever come. But somehow he was like, still it moved me so much to see that somebody cared. And so whether it's that or in our current climate, you know, there was talk about creating a Muslim registry. It's been, you know, obviously the travel ban's been implemented. So, and that was based on a campaign promise about a complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. The target community may change, but some of these general ideas about let's make a list, let's have it ready to go in case a national emergency happens again. It's not, unfortunately, American history doesn't allow us to think that it's just a simple straight line, right? It's more like a pendulum. We have these moments when America lives up to its great idea of being a place of refuge for many different peoples and different foods, culture, people coming together and creating some amazing culture, you know. Or sometimes that pendulum swings towards a more narrow understanding of what it means to be American. And we have these swings, right? And But in those swings, or how we act in those moments, I remember that story about that 90-some-year-old woman. It's people like that standing up, seeing how their histories are interlinked with others that for whom they may not have any blood or any other relationship, but just community members that need some assurance that maybe your community right now, whether it's a racial or religious animus from certain quarters that paint all of you as one way, there'll be people who think that's un-American.
Okay, so 2 last questions.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to that? What has America actually lived up and fulfilled that promise that you talked about in the pendulum swinging towards kind of collective liberation and justice?
Just one, and then the second question, just to end it.
I thank you so much for your book. I was very moved by a lot of this. My parents grew up in the 30s and 20s, Latinos and when they were kids, they were punished for speaking their language. And the trauma that I didn't even realize I have. The trauma that I didn't realize I have, that generational, is brought up by this. So I'm just wondering, as folks, and from my father-in-laws and other folks, how have you dealt with that trauma? What suggestions can you give? Because when you talk about that, my father was a Latino in World War II, and he ended up in the occupation forces. And I've seen pictures of him as probably the only Latino in that group. So I'm thinking, how was he treated by white American soldiers while he's in Kobe, Japan, after the war? And I can only imagine what was going on there. And I just wonder how you, as folks, dealt with that trauma, or some thoughts.
You know, sometimes they say that people of that generation didn't want to talk that much about what all happened, precisely to try to shield the next generation from all of the negative messages that they got about, you know, that you don't belong here. And so sometimes it vectored around language, sometimes it vectored around food, sometimes it vectored whatever it was that would steer things, whether visible or invisible, towards belonging, right? But what I've always found so moving, and I'm trying to connect the first question second, but to me, these kind of American ideals of things like equality under the law, due process, religious freedom, they're just words on a piece of paper unless people embody them and actualize it. And if somebody else is not doing it, we do it. Something like that. And to me, it's kind of these people, maybe like your dad, who took a chance to marry somebody who's very different in Kobe, Japan, right? No. Oh, no?
He was in part of the occupation.
Part of the U.S. occupation of Japan. And
He liked Japanese food.
okay, good. But it takes people of different backgrounds going through different things and kind of finding connections with each other that I think help to ease that trauma. Because at the end of the day, to me, like, that's what Buddhism is all about. Is the Buddha taught one thing, his Deer Park sermon was, I teach suffering. We could just replace that with the word trauma, and I teach the end to trauma, right? So and the message that he gave was, you can only do that when you see the world as interlinked. When you don't see yourself as a permanent thing that's unchanging, but also a thing that's autonomous and like disconnected from everybody else. We're not alone. We're interlinked. And so whether it's interlinked through history and kind of intergenerationally, or interlinked through ourselves with each other, including all sentient, including all species and across time and space, to me, that's the basis of healing that trauma. And so the only tips I can always give, whether it's a kind of more political question or a more personal question, is let's see if we can see that interlinked thing to notice how we're not alone.